Hey, did you know that more than 90% of our viewers listen every night but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these gangster sleep stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's completely free and helps us keep these underworld tales alive. Now, get comfortable, unwind, and drift into tonight's story. Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight, our story follows Joseph Aiello, the man who rose from an immigrant baker to one of Chicago's most determined power players. Before we begin, like this video, we're aiming for 100 likes in this video. It truly helps us keep these powerful stories alive. Share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. Your support motivates us to bring you even more fascinating stories from the underworld. Now, settle in and let the story of Joseph Aiello guide you into the night. He was born Giuseppe, from the land of stone terraces and narrow streets near Palermo, where family names mattered and long memories guided quiet decisions. He grew up in a place that taught thrift and watchfulness. Work was hard to find, opportunity even harder, and a ship across the ocean looked like a road more than the roads under his feet. Like many families in that era, the Aiellos kept close, sending word across the sea that the new country had wages, markets, and if you were clever, a kind of crowd that let you prove yourself quickly. He followed brothers who had gone ahead, the pull of shared blood stronger than any map. The first American years were not elegant. They were made of rented rooms, long hours, and a second language learned through haggling and mistakes. Before Chicago, he found a foothold in upstate New York, a place where fellow Sicilians opened groceries and import shops and leaned on each other in the old style. Utica had small factories, steady pay for those who wanted it, and back rooms where news ran from table to table faster than any letter. Joseph watched, saved, and drafted a plan. He understood that food was not just food for his community. It was comfort, identity, and a constant need. He learned how to bring in cheese, olive oil, and other staples, building a reputation for quality and punctual delivery. That meant contacts on the docks, relationships with wholesalers, and the skill to keep prices fair without losing his own margin. By the time he reached Chicago, the city was racing. Prohibition, passed with good intentions far from the neighborhoods that had to live with it, put a lock on bottles, and opened 100 new doors. Men who understood supply and demand could make fortunes if they kept their heads and picked the right allies. Joseph was not the only one who sensed the change. Established gangs built out their networks. Neighborhood societies organized dances and relief funds while wielding quiet leverage. Newcomers with sharp eyes found ways to move sugar, yeast, and whatever else a thirsty city needed to turn grain into something people would pay to drink. Joseph and his brothers set up shop as importers and grocers, trading in cheese and other goods that laid a respectable base. That storefront, with its barrels and scales, was a business, a signal of legitimacy, and a listening post. Sicilian mutual aid groups were central to that world. The most powerful in Chicago was the Unione Siciliana, a club that began as a safety net and turned into a gatekeeper. Membership offered connections, jobs, and protection. Leadership, though, brought something more. Influence that extended far beyond monthly dues. The Unione's president could bless business deals, calm disputes, and swing the opinion of men who made things happen in the night. When Antonio "Tony" Lombardo, a respected figure with strong ties to a rising power on the South Side, held that presidency, Joseph read the room and saw both a ceiling and an opening. He knew that Lombardo's name drew weight in the immigrant community, and with Al Capone, who relied on Sicilian support even as he came from Neapolitan roots. A presidency welded to Capone's orbit meant that anyone who wanted the fat share of contracts and access had to walk through a door Lombardo controlled. Joseph had no interest in standing at the threshold. He worked to build standing among Sicilian businessmen, calling in favors and promising practical help. He cultivated grocers and warehouse owners and kept an ear to church steps after Mass, where gossip on Saturday turned to action by Monday. In those conversations, he cast himself as a man who would keep the Unione in Sicilian hands without bending to any outsider's will. This message landed well with some older members who disliked the idea that any single non-Sicilian boss, no matter how strong, could dictate their affairs. In the background, his cheese and grocery operation kept making steady money, which bought patience and loyalty. None of that happened in the open. It was done softly, one handshake at a time. Tension with Lombardo brought a larger shadow to bear. You could not challenge that link to the South Side without stirring Al Capone's attention. By 1926 and 1927, the city already had suffered through shootings tied to earlier conflicts. The Genna brothers, Sicilian operators who had run a sizable racket and had leaned toward the South Side, were gone, some dead, others fled. Their territory, their workers, and their revenue did not just vanish, they became prizes. Joseph moved to pick up pieces of that trade, especially in neighborhoods where his language and manners matched the storefront signs. That brought him into competition with men who believed the map was already drawn and signed. From there, the feud stopped being a quiet disagreement over a club presidency and turned into something sharper. Reports from those years describe offers made and threats exchanged through intermediaries. Joseph, out of patience with Lombardo's hold on the Unione, began looking for ways to break that tie. He reached out, according to police and press accounts, to men who might do what bullets do in a city where juries were hard to move. Investigators later wrote that he offered serious money to anyone who could remove Lombardo from the path. He also put out word, more than once, that there would be rich rewards for anyone who brought down Capone himself. At one point, the whispers settled on a plan to tamper with food or drink where Capone took his meals, a quick strike that would leave no public gunfire. Cooks and waiters, ordinary workers trying to hold on to their wages, became targets for bribes. Some went straight to Capone's men to report the approach. Others talked to the police, who knew the outlines of the game even if they could not always stop it. Each rumor brought tighter security, new counters, and a hardening of sides. Those offers were reckless, but they were also a clear signal. The South Side responded. Joseph saw his homes and businesses watched. Cars trailed him. Shots rang out near places he had just left. One barrage peppered a residence, forcing his family to scramble for safety and convincing him to keep moving. He used safe apartments around the city, and when pressure grew too hot, he slipped out to friends in Milwaukee, Buffalo, and back to Utica for spells of quiet. Police frequently picked him up for questioning during those trips, sometimes on minor charges like carrying a concealed gun or on suspicion meant to shake him from his rhythm. The paper trail from those stops painted a picture of a man always in motion, surrounded by familiar faces from the old country, constantly making calls. Behind the noise sat a practical reality. Bootlegging was an economy with supply chains. Grain moved here, sugar there, barrels and trucks and drivers all needed coordinating. Joseph did not try to dominate every link. He chose places where he could trust his cousins and countrymen and partnered with crews that shared his enemies. That brought him into sympathy with North Side operators who had suffered from South Side pressure. He met in neutral spots with men tied to George Bugs Moran's world, seeking terms that would allow each side to move product without tipping into constant fighting. These arrangements, however, lived or died on the Unione Siciliana question. As long as Lombardo held that chair and Capone benefited from it, nothing else felt settled. The calendar turned, and accusations escalated. Newspapers printed Joseph's name beside the words rival and plot. Detectives claimed to intercept letters and messages describing plans to strike at Lombardo. Joseph, for his part, told sympathetic friends that he was defending the independence of his community from a boss he had not chosen. That line resonated, especially among older Sicilians who distrusted outsiders. Younger men were drawn by Joseph's promise to push back hard, to win resources they felt had been denied them. He built a crew of lieutenants who handled deliveries, guarded meetings, and passed messages. No uniform, no badges, but a structure that functioned with discipline and clear roles. As the summer of 1927 warmed the city, the confrontation edged towards something irreversible. Lombardo lived his days under watch, yet still greeted visitors and held court in his storefront office. Joseph never stopped pressing his case. He sent envoys to local clubhouses, to social gatherings, to weddings, and put his choice of words in the mouths of men who knew exactly who was in the room. He bought rounds of coffee at corner cafes and asked for votes without ballots. He told them he would run the Unione for Sicilians, not for Southside bosses. The pitch was simple, but the risk was obvious. Every such move bled into a larger struggle, drawing attention from men who had no interest in fair contests. Law enforcement saw enough to worry about spirals of retaliation, but they couldn't put the pieces back in the box. Chicago's courts were crowded and cautious. Witnesses were scarce. Jurors were wary, so warnings piled up. Officers stopped Joseph at train stations, noted the names traveling with him, warned him that his life was under threat. He brushed past such cautions because backing down would have collapsed his credibility. In that world, if you showed fear, you didn't just lose face. You lost influence, contracts, territory. He told associates that the only way forward was through, and that once he secured the Union, everything else would fall into place. Meanwhile, incidents with carloads of gunmen swept past his locations at odd hours. A meeting in a West Side flat ended early after a phone call hinted that strangers had asked too many questions downstairs. Drivers he trusted took routes that changed by the week. He shifted his sleeping quarters over and over. The constant movement wore him down, though he never showed it in public. He made a point to appear composed when he stepped into a cafe or walked into a church gathering, hat in hand, offering a measured smile and a respectful greeting to elders who needed to see that nothing had rattled him. Those moments sustained his campaign as much as any dollar he spent. By late 1927, something fundamental had changed about Joseph's place in the city. He wasn't just a merchant or a local organizer. He was a declared opponent to the most powerful force in Chicago's underground economy. The Unione Siciliana, which had once been a ladder up, had become a battlefield. The cheese importer who saw a chance to grow had transformed into a figure who lived with a constant clock in his head. The hour to press his advantage was now, he thought, before winter set in, and before the other side locked down every alley and hallway. Men around him urged patience. Others argued for decisive action. The road he chose would define the rest of his short life. By the end of that tense summer, he had learned how to live with a suitcase half-packed and a phone that never rang without raising the hairs at the back of his neck. He kept business moving anyway. Mornings began with ledger pages, deliveries, invoices, the normal pulse of a grocer and importer with a growing name. The Aiello brothers had built a trade that felt respectable at a glance. Cheeses formed in clean rooms, barrels of olives, sacks of flour, tins of tomatoes stacked by the door. Behind those shelves sat connections that reached farther, to warehouses where sugar left in bulk, to drivers who knew which alleys to avoid, to men who could fix broken trucks in the dark without asking questions. That dual life, legitimate on paper and opportunistic on the street, was not unique in that era, but few carried the burden of rivalry as visible as his. He wanted the chair of the Union, and he wanted to loosen the grip of a man who had not risen from the Sicilian clubs. He kept showing up where people expected him to vanish. Church steps after Mass, a hand on the shoulder of an older member who needed to hear that the younger generation would still consult the elders. A table at a coffee house where talk drifted easily from soccer scores to shipping schedules to who was courting whose niece. In those rooms, he was the patient salesman of a political idea. The Unione Siciliana should answer to Sicilian members, not to a man whose money came from across the city. He made promises that sounded practical. Membership dues would fund funeral benefits and small loans again, not disappear into someone else's war chest. Disputes between grocers would be settled quietly, not by outsiders with their own agendas. For a while, that message gave him momentum. A coalition of grocers, produce dealers, and importers rallied around him because they recognized their own grievances in his voice. Pressure from the other side tightened with every meeting. Surveillance cars idled near his storefront. Unfamiliar faces loitered near routine drop-offs. A cousin who handled accounts was followed home one evening, doubled back, and slept at a friend's place instead. A carpentry shop 2 doors down from a favored cafe closed suddenly. Within days, the shop front had a new tenant that never seemed to sell anything, but always had 2 men reading newspapers in the window. The meaning was plain enough. If he couldn't be persuaded to stop, he would be forced to. He hired more lookouts, rechecked the habits of every driver and messenger, and changed his routes. He moved his family out of the most obvious residence and used 3 apartments to keep them safe, a practical decision that also sent a message of resilience to allies who watched him closely for any sign of retreat. What he did next turned from politics to something sharper. Police files and later interviews recorded offers that left little doubt about intent. He approached intermediaries who knew cooks and waiters where the South Side boss liked to eat. He put money on tables and asked for quiet outcomes that would end the feud in a single evening. One chef, faced with a sum that could have changed his life, reported the approach. Word circled back to the intended target, security tightened, and the fear that had once flowed one way began to flow in both directions. At the same time, envelopes moved through the grapevine that carried figures large enough to tempt professional gunmen. Newspapers wrote that bounties had been posted. The exact amounts vary from account to account, but the gist is consistent. He was ready to pay dearly to remove two men he considered obstacles, Lombardo and the man behind Lombardo. These offers did more than raise the temperature. They marked him as a contender who would not limit himself to speeches in social halls. That made it easier for other enemies of the South Side to reach out. He found common cause with elements on the North Side who felt squeezed. Meetings took place in rooms with curtains drawn, in apartments borrowed from friends who never put their names on the bell. He showed up with a careful argument. If they coordinated, their trucks could move supplies and finished product through a patchwork of blocks without tripping over each other. If they resisted separately, the other side would isolate them and then pick them apart. Agreements were made, not always written down, but held together by the sense that their fortunes rose and fell together. This alliance by necessity did not erase differences in style or background, but it gave every participant more capacity than they had alone. Meanwhile, the commercial core of his life kept humming. The cheese operation grew because housewives and restaurants still needed what he sold. He prided himself on paying his workers on time. He invested in better refrigeration and kept warehouses tidy. But those successes were inseparable from the wider economy of prohibition, where sugar and yeast could be more valuable than anything aged in a cave. He knew who could take a rail car of sweetener and make it vanish from a public ledger without anyone at the station seeing a thing. He made introductions among suppliers in the Midwest and buyers who paid cash. In Cleveland and Buffalo, he cultivated Sicilian contacts who moved bulk goods without stirring headlines. These were not quiet charity connections. They were business relationships that required steady nerve and discretion. Each tie reinforced his claim that he could manage large flows and keep promises. Traits that mattered to men who did not suffer fools. Lombardo's camp countered by emphasizing the benefits of stability. They sent their own envoys into the same cafes and club rooms and argued that Joseph's ambition threatened to plunge the community into a spiral with no guarantee of victory. Money moved too. Dues were forgiven, small debts wiped clean, hospital bills covered for members' families in need. Joseph answered with contributions of his own, and with a promise that once he held the presidency, he would restore the Unione's role as a protector, rather than a conduit for someone else's power. That contest for hearts and minds took place in the open, even as darker exchanges unfolded behind the scenes. It was a Chicago habit of that time. Speak softly at the door, act decisively once inside. The summer turned to fall, and the calculations grew more urgent. He spent a stretch in Milwaukee after a friend warned him that an ambush had been arranged near his flat. The train ride felt like a reprieve, a few hours where the only threat was a conductor checking tickets. In Milwaukee, he kept a low profile, checked in with old acquaintances, and gave the impression to police that he was simply visiting family. They questioned him once for carrying a handgun without a permit. He paid a fine and walked out. Careful to say little, more careful to be seen by the right people, so that word of his presence reached the right ears. From there, he slipped to Utica for a week, revisiting the early days when his ambitions had seemed manageable. In each place, he took meetings with men who could supply manpower or counsel. The theme was the same. He was not going to shelve his campaign. He wanted back into Chicago with added force. When he returned, he sharpened the push against Lombardo. Allies kept an informal count of who had pledged support. The number was never firm, but it gave him confidence that a vote, if it could be held without interference, would go his way. Interference was the point, though. The South Side did not plan to let a ballot decide where influence flowed. That meant the president would have to be removed for a change to happen. Accounts differ on who decided that the time had come and who organized the details. Some point to North Side men who had old grudges with Lombardo because of past clashes. Others insist Joseph's circle orchestrated the move so that he could claim the seat. Either way, September brought a breaking point. On a busy day in the Loop, Lombardo stepped into the street near his place of business and never made it back to his office. Newsboys shouted the headlines before dinner that evening. Police flooded the district, taking statements from shaken bystanders who had seen figures move and then vanish into traffic. Reporters reached out to everyone who had an opinion on who gained and who lost. Joseph's name took up more ink in the following days than at any time before. He did not claim credit. He did not deny involvement. He stayed off the street for a day and then made a deliberate tour through places where he knew he would be seen. He shook hands, offered condolences in public for the loss of a community leader, and said that the Union should now choose a steward who put the group first. Friends told him to leave the city again until tempers cooled. He answered that leaving would look like guilt and that his campaign had weathered too much for him to vanish now. The counterpunch came fast. Cars shadowed him constantly. At least 2 attempts were made to corner him as he left meetings. In one instance, a truck blocked his driver on a narrow side street, only for a second vehicle behind to stall just long enough for them to squeeze past. A home used by his relatives caught a spray of bullets late at night that shattered windows and lamps without harming anyone inside. The message was clear. Any comfort he took from Lombardo's removal would be short-lived. Yet from Joseph's perspective, something important had shifted. The desk he wanted was now open, and even if the other side tried to install a successor, that man would step into the role under a cloud. He told supporters that they had paid dearly to reach this point, and that wavering now would squander their sacrifices. Law enforcement, worried that the city would slide into a string of retaliatory incidents, dragged him in for long sessions and asked the same questions over and over. Where had he been that afternoon? Who had he seen? Who could vouch for him? He responded with calm answers and kept counsel, knowing that without a witness ready to testify in open court, the questioning would end with a shrug. Reporters camped outside stations to catch a glimpse and ask if he feared for his life. He looked into their notebooks and said that any man who lived in Chicago under Prohibition understood risk, then stepped into a car that circled twice before committing to a route. Every outing became choreography. He refused to let that show in his posture. In public, he maintained an easy manner, pausing to greet an elder or to buy coffee for a table of young men who watched him like they were studying how to walk through a storm. In the weeks after Lombardo's death, the contest for the Unione's leadership was a quiet war of lists and meetings. A replacement aligned with the South Side presented himself and was quickly promoted by that faction as the natural guardian of tradition. Joseph objected, saying the presidency had to arise from a genuine vote unpressured by outside forces. He kept pushing his case citywide, but he also looked beyond Chicago for leverage. He traveled east again, visiting figures in Buffalo and New York who paid attention when a Chicago man arrived with both money and grievances. He laid out a case that the Sicilian community in Chicago deserved leadership answerable to its members. If those out-of-town heavyweights recognized him as the legitimate representative, he would return that respect with mutually beneficial trade. Such recognition would not be advertised, but it would carry weight in back rooms where endorsements mattered. Those trips brought him to rooms where men measured every sentence, where coffee cooled while long silences settled, where a statement of support could be delivered as a nod rather than a paragraph. Out of town, allies offered encouragement, and, in some cases, small detachments of talent, willing to relocate for a season if the work paid well. But even the most sympathetic voices warned him that he had stirred an opponent who would not hesitate to commit resources until the grievance was resolved. He nodded, said that he understood, and laid out plans to house and employ the arrivals. He wasn't building a parade. He was trying to survive long enough to change an institution, and every new recruit was a day he might live through the next confrontation. He returned to a city that felt primed for a decisive turn. The other side intended to anoint a successor to Lombardo, and to make an example of anyone who challenged the choice. Joseph intended to keep pressing until the presidency reflected the will of the members he had courted for months. Between those aims lay a narrow path. He maintained a schedule that looked almost ordinary at a glance. Factory in the morning, 2 or 3 stops at cafes, or small groceries by midday, a visit to a back office where he could make calls off the main line, a late afternoon conference in a neighborhood that had pledged loyalty. The routine worked until it didn't. Even a careful man can be studied. Even a cautious driver can be predicted over time. The story of those weeks sits in overlapping accounts, some written down by detectives, others preserved in news clippings and family memories. What is certain is that he continued the campaign without retreat, that he held together an alliance with North Side operators who preferred his claims over the South Side's, and that his name remained on the front page far more often than he would have liked. He had started as a merchant with ambition, become a community organizer with a cause, and then crossed a line where arranging and resisting violence were part of daily calculations. He did not present himself as a hero. He presented himself as a defender of a community's independence. The city, with its own rhythms and appetite for drama, watched to see whether that vision could survive the pressures it had invited. The day after Lombardo fell, the old conversations at cafes and storefronts sounded different. Names were spoken in lower tones. Chairs were pulled closer, and even the habitual jokers kept glancing at the door. Joseph moved through that hush with a steady face. He had spent months arguing that the Union should not be tied to outside command. Now the chair was empty. He let it be known that he would accept the responsibility if the membership wanted him. He called on elders he had courted all year, thanked them for their patience, and promised that if he took the seat, he would turn the treasury back to its original purpose. For a brief moment, some thought the argument had been decided. It lasted until word spread that a new favorite backed by the South Side would be put forward at once. The man promoted as successor was a quiet grocer with an old country surname and long-standing ties to the faction that had supported Lombardo. The message could not have been clearer. From that day, Joseph's window to claim the title shrank to a sliver. He didn't wait. He had letters sent to out-of-town figures who understood the way Sicilian associations worked, putting his request in respectful terms. He asked for recognition from respected bosses beyond Chicago, an old-world kind of endorsement that sometimes tipped a scale when locals were divided. He also kept up a daily rhythm in the neighborhoods, shaking hands in front of shop windows and staying close to the very people whose votes he had chased all year. Police treated him as both a target and a suspect. They questioned him at length, sometimes twice in the same week, about who he had met and where he had been on the afternoon Lombardo was ambushed. Without eyewitnesses willing to point a finger, all they could do was apply pressure. He answered carefully, signed for his property, and walked out into air that felt watched. There were searches of garages and storerooms used by his circle. Officers found ammunition and a few weapons tucked behind crates. It wasn't unusual for merchants who moved cash to keep protection at hand in those years. But the timing made every discovery look like part of a larger plan. Fines were paid, court dates were set, defense lawyers filed motions and made the rounds. His business did not stop. Cheese didn't cut itself, orders didn't fill themselves, trucks didn't load on their own. He kept payroll moving, saw to repairs, bought new equipment, and reminded his staff to keep their heads down. The company's respectable front mattered more than ever. It gave him a reason to stand in a doorway with an apron and a pencil, taking orders while watchers 3 doors away tried to decide if he'd make a move. It protected relatives who showed up before dawn and left after dark with sore backs and clean hands. It also fed an operation that depended on cash. He used that cash to keep allies paid and drivers loyal, and to help families of men who had been arrested because they chose his side. In every neighborhood, nothing spoke louder than taking care of your people. The feud spilled into routine life in 100 tiny ways. A neighbor stopped saying hello. A friend's cousin changed jobs without explanation. A familiar bartender moved to another street. When strangers appeared on corners, men who knew the district measured the way they leaned against a wall and the shoes they wore. Joseph learned to read those signs at a glance. He shifted appointments at the last minute, used a back entrance when he didn't like the look of a sidewalk, and never sat with his back to a window. Those habits saved him more than once. They also isolated him. The calm he projected in public still had to be paid for in private with vigilance that never eased. He didn't pretend his campaign was clean. Offers circulated again, this time not only to men who could get close to the South Side boss, but to anyone who could cut off the influence that boss wielded inside the Union. The sums were high, the terms explicit. Remove the obstacle, get paid. It wasn't a secret in the underworld. It was a signal. And signals invite answers. The other side stepped up its own efforts to find him, to corner him, to turn those closest to him. Drivers were approached with promises of easy money if they would deliver him to a meeting alone or delay at a particular corner. One driver accepted a deposit, then turned it over along with the story. A reminder that loyalty ran both ways when men believed you would keep faith with them. He kept lines open to the north side. Those crews had their own reasons to see the south side checked. He had shared information with them about alcohol routes and had arranged lanes that kept their trucks from colliding with his. After Lombardo's death, they met more frequently, sharing coffee and cigarettes in quiet rooms while maps were unfolded on kitchen tables. The plan was to avoid waste. If they collided, the other side benefited. If they divided the city into workable paths and pooled lookouts, they could move more safely. It was not friendship. It was calculation. And Joseph liked calculations because they gave him parts he could control. Out-of-town trips were part of that calculation. He went east more than once, making time for Buffalo, where leaders with Sicilian roots kept a close eye on Chicago. He traveled under his own name some days, under a cousin's on others, paying cash for tickets, and often taking a morning train while his enemies assumed he wouldn't risk daylight. Along those routes, he repeated the same case. He wanted the Union to be free of outside pressure. He wanted backing that could be felt even if it was never announced. He promised commercial cooperation in return, including connections to suppliers and buyers who didn't ask for written contracts. Some older bosses liked his directness and his respect for formalities. Others warned him that an open feud with the South Side was a long road with short exits. One killing that summer and early fall made a particular impression on him. A powerful man from Brooklyn, with an international reputation, was cut down on a busy avenue far from Chicago. News of that drive-by crossed the country in a day. It told Joseph something he already suspected. The boss he opposed had reached that extended well beyond city limits. If that kind of strike could be arranged in New York, then the streets of Chicago held even fewer safe zones than his map suggested. He took the lesson and deepened his caution. Apartments used as safe houses were changed after a single night. He rotated drivers and never used the same car 2 days in a row. Even with that, he understood that only a decisive change inside the Union would reduce his exposure. The community he claimed to represent saw both sides of him. Parishioners watched him kneel in pews and speak softly to widows. Shopkeepers saw him count coins for small loans and make introductions that solved business disputes. At the same time, they read newspapers that tied his name to plots and bribes. He lived with that contradiction. He had chosen to fight from within a community that had once drawn a line between mutual aid and rackets. Prohibition erased much of that line across the city. He adapted, telling himself that outcomes mattered more than appearances because the stakes were control of an institution that could either strengthen or hollow out their neighborhoods. City Hall tried to give the appearance of control. The mayor delivered public remarks, promising order, and telling citizens that they would see more officers on the streets. Special details were assigned to watch certain corners and doors. Raids were announced in the press, with tables lined with seized bottles for photographers. Joseph watched those performances without illusions. He understood that the real contest was not theater. It was a private struggle to see who could outlast the other without blinking. He also knew that every public gesture could close a window for him. So he used what time he had to push his message one more time through every hall and storefront that would open its door. In those weeks, he drew closer to a handful of lieutenants. Each had a defined task. One handled communications with Northside contacts. Another supervised trucks and ensured that vehicles didn't all take the same roads. A third kept his schedules and controlled who learned about last-minute changes. They used simple codes on the phone and avoided names whenever they could. They also kept track of family matters. Who needed money for rent? Who had a sick child? Who needed a lawyer after a weapons charge? Keeping those burdens covered let men concentrate on their tasks. It wasn't charity. It was survival strategy. He explored one more tactic that played to his strengths. Economic pressure. In districts where he had influence, suppliers knew that their routes were safer because his watchers were posted along key blocks. In return, he expected a cut. It wasn't optional. If a supplier tried to bypass his arrangement, a visit followed. It was not a theatrical warning. It was a short conversation where a simple point was made. The road you use is protected by people who work for us. Pay your share. Those who paid enjoyed the benefits. Those who didn't sometimes found that trucks broke down more often and orders were delayed by hands they couldn't see. That income fed the campaign. It was a crime in legal terms and an accepted practice in that underground economy. He treated it as a tool. Religious festivals and weddings presented both danger and opportunity. They brought the Sicilian community together, and they gave him chances to speak with elders in settings where soldiers from the other side were less likely to make a scene. He attended selectively, arriving late, leaving early, and always choosing a seat with sightlines to the door. At those gatherings, he repeated, again and again, that he wanted the Union to function as a mutual aid society, not a pipeline for another faction's agenda. He appealed to tradition, to pride, to the sense that their parents and grandparents had built something designed to outlast any single strongman. The argument resonated enough to keep his base intact. By October, his name was in the papers nearly every week. Editorials speculated on whether he would gain formal control of the Union or be forced out of the city entirely. He became a symbol for those who believed that Sicilian institutions should not be controlled by anyone outside their own councils. He was also a symbol, to his enemies, of stubborn resistance that had to be erased if peace was to be purchased on their terms. He heard that kind of talk through his informants, as clearly as they heard his. The spiral grew tighter. On more than one occasion, he left Chicago overnight after whisper received through steady channels convinced him that a trap had been set. He spent a few days in Cleveland and returned without announcement. Once he slipped to Rockford for a night at a cousin's place and came back before dawn. Those trips weren't retreats. They were meant to throw off patterns. He knew that hunters watch the habits of the hunted. If he could break his own routine often enough, he believed he could buy the time required to make the Union change hands. Publicly, the rival faction insisted that the new presidency would bring stability. Flyers appeared at clubhouses naming a slate of officers who promised to care for members' needs and to keep politics out of the association. Joseph responded with visits to the same rooms, reminding everyone that he had been the one to speak for Sicilian independence all along. He didn't insult the rival by name in those spaces, refusing to give the other side a soundbite. He relied instead on a simple contrast: a leader chosen by members versus a leader chosen elsewhere. That contrast had power, even among men who feared the fallout of choosing the losing side. As the calendar advanced, he accepted that he was living with a countdown he could not see. That sense sharpened his focus. He cut out distractions, delegated tasks he had once handled himself, and stopped attending a few social rituals that had long been routine. Friends noticed the difference. So did his enemies. Reports came back to him describing unfamiliar faces, nodding to each other near the places where he met with supporters. He moved one meeting to a different address, 20 minutes before the hour, after a boy posted near the front door spotted a man pretending to read a newspaper across the street while watching the building's reflection in a shop window. The meeting went forward without incident at the new location. He took that as proof that the systems he had built still worked. Then he made the choice that set the final stretch. After a last round of talks back east, he returned to Chicago determined to be physically present in the very neighborhoods whose backing he claimed. He knew that staying away for too long would feed a story that he was afraid. Presence mattered as much as votes. He distributed envelopes to families who had taken risks on his behalf, sat for coffee in places he had avoided for months, and allowed himself to be seen walking briefly without a coat on a mild afternoon, so newspapers could print a photo that showed him looking like a man unconcerned by rumors. He did all of that while keeping his guard up, rotating cars, avoiding habit, and keeping most meetings short. The rival camp responded with a show of certainty. The new Unione officers held well-attended events and invited priests and respected businessmen to lend their names. Joseph watched these developments without giving an inch. He was still pressing for a vote he believed he could win if the ballot were clean. He pressed so hard because he knew that time worked against him. The South Side would not tolerate a prolonged standoff. Pressure would keep rising until one side quit or one side fell. He had no plan to quit. He told those closest to him that the Unione was the hinge. If he moved it, doors would open. If not, he would be forced to live as a fugitive forever. In the middle of that rush, he also tried to keep a few ordinary rituals alive. He visited his mother's apartment under cover of darkness, leaving fresh fruit and a little money on the table and slipping out before sunrise. He checked on a worker's boy who had broken an arm, made sure the doctor was paid, and told the father to stay home a week without worry. He took time to stand under a tree in Humboldt Park for 5 minutes, breathing cool air and remembering when the most complicated part of his day had been balancing orders for Parmesan against demand for mozzarella. Those moments gave him just enough balance to keep moving forward. October settled in. The light changed. Wind off the lake felt sharper. Meetings clustered in the afternoon, when the streets were at their most crowded. He stayed close to the west side, to familiar blocks where his name carried weight. The healthier path would have been to vanish and start over somewhere else, perhaps across the border. But he had built his name here and staked his claim on a public fight. He refused to let the other side write his ending without him in the room. So he set his schedule for a day that looked ordinary to anyone not paying close attention. It began with invoices and ended with 2 short visits in apartments, chosen because the exits were quick and the angles were good. It was a plan that would have worked a dozen times before. This time, the city around him had learned too much about how he moved. He left the first apartment after a short meeting that should have ended the day quietly, but a man posted at the end of the block didn't like the way a parked car rocked after the wind died. That tiny movement meant someone inside had shifted, waiting for a sign. Joseph reversed course without making it look like a retreat. He cut through a grocer's side door, walked the length of a storeroom, and slipped out to a second alley where a driver he trusted kept the motor low and the lights off. It had become second nature to switch plans in an instant. You did it to live. He took that detour across 3 blocks, climbed 2 flights to another flat, and finished the business he had started. Keeping allies aligned, urging patience, promising that the campaign for the Unione's chair still had a path. There was never just one front. Police attention had intensified since the afternoon when Lombardo went down. He was hauled in repeatedly. Not on an indictment for that killing, no witness would stand in a courtroom to say his name, but for familiar charges that kept the pressure on. Carrying a pistol without a permit, suspicion of running trucks that didn't appear on city delivery lists, a ledger entry that didn't match a tax receipt. He met each of those with counsel at his side and documents in order when possible. Fines were paid, weapons surrendered, and then replaced because an unarmed man with his profile was a walking invitation to disaster. He accepted the tedious cycles because they were easier to survive than the other kind of attention. The neighborhood fight over the Union moved in stages. A successor was named to fill Lombardo's place. He belonged to the camp Joseph opposed, and his selection was presented as a return to calm. Joseph wasn't tempted by the word calm. He had worked too long to step aside just when the seat had opened. He told anyone who would listen that an outside power had no right to turn a mutual aid society into an annex of a private empire. That message landed, but messages didn't move appointments. So he pushed in other ways, the ways that had gotten him this far. He met with men who had influence on the East Coast, asked for a nod that would carry weight, and promised reciprocal respect in their own affairs. He also kept his own city network busy with the everyday tasks that made a campaign real. Visiting elders, settling disputes, paying rent for a member short on cash, staying visible in the places that grounded his claim. At the same time, he wasn't shy about bolder tactics. Word circulated that more money had been placed on 2 names that stood between him and his goal, one inside the Union and the man who benefited from the Union's loyalty. Sums reported in the press varied, but all agreed they were large enough to tempt professionals. The offers reached men with reputations for discreet work, cooks and waiters who could get close without attracting attention, and independent operators who knew how to disappear. Several approached with money told the story to the other side or to police. Others considered it and walked away because the target was surrounded by a security net so dense that any attempt looked like a short road to a cell or worse. Each new approach tightened the circle around Joseph. He knew the cost of that strategy, even as he kept trying to make it pay. The new Union president did not last. He was visited at home on a weekday afternoon and never returned to his seat at the head table. It was the second time in months that leadership aligned with the South Side had been removed with speed. Joseph did not crow about it in public. He understood that the city's patience was thin, the newspapers relentless, and sympathy scarce for anyone tied to the wars that Prohibition had unleashed. But in private, he let out a breath he had been holding, because every such fall reopened the question that mattered most to him. Who would guide the association that shaped decisions in his community? He pressed his case again, argued for a fair vote, and kept calling on the older men who had always seen the Unione as a shield for working families. That winter brought a shock that none of the neighborhoods would forget. A garage on the north side became the scene of a notorious mid-morning slaughter that filled front pages across the country. The men targeted were enemies of the South Side power, and the image of that day hung over Chicago like a cloud. Joseph hadn't ordered it, but the effect washed over his plans anyway. Pressure from authorities spiked. Politicians promised action. Patrols increased. Anyone recognizable as part of the underground economy felt officials' impatience at every corner. He responded by cutting his visible movements further, avoiding any gathering big enough to be easy to watch, and conducting meetings in 2s and 3s instead of rooms full of loyalists. He insisted to his circle that the principles of his campaign hadn't changed. Yet he also knew that speed had become more dangerous and delay more expensive. As the winter thawed, another successor was proposed for the Union, a man with a small frame and a reputation for keeping his head down. He too appeared, under the protection of friends from the South Side. For a moment it looked as if that quiet candidate might stabilize the situation. That moment didn't last either. Rumors thickened that he had wavered in his allegiance or reached out to rivals. Not long after, he was gone as well. Removed in a way that made headlines but offered few details. Each rapid turnover made Joseph's argument stronger among traditionalists, who resented the idea that their club had become a lever pulled by someone who did not share their lineage. Each fall also hardened the resolve of the men on the other side to put an end to the contest by removing the man who kept reopening it. Through all of this, Joseph's businesses kept their routines. Cheese wheels came in, were cut, wrapped, and sent to restaurants and homes. Sugar was purchased in bulk by clients with an appetite for distilling that didn't slow simply because the weather did. He collected on accounts, extended credit to those who had proven reliable, and glared at ledgers that rarely balanced the way he wished. He kept close watch on the supply chain that mattered most to his bottom line. Drivers received route cards that changed daily, not just to dodge law enforcement but to stay out of the way of rivals' trucks. He sometimes outsourced runs to independent haulers in Cleveland or Milwaukee, who did not know the broader picture but could move goods without creating a pattern that a Chicago watcher would spot after 2 weeks. Police contacts told him bluntly that he was living on borrowed time. A detective he had known for years pulled him aside one evening and said, as a man rather than an officer, that the other side would not stop until they had settled accounts. Joseph thanked him and went back to his routines. He didn't pretend the warnings surprised him. Death threats had been part of his life since the first time he told someone to speak for himself rather than take orders. He judged that retreat would erase everything he had argued about for so long. If he withdrew to Buffalo or New York, he might live longer. He would also be remembered in Chicago as a man who couldn't carry a burden to the step where decisions were made. He lived in a world where reputation paid bills as surely as cash. He tried varied tactics to take the heat off without abandoning the fight. He asked an influential priest to chair a meeting on charity work, inviting men from all sides to donate to families in need. He attended a wake and kept to a back corner, then paid for a round of coffee for the mourners without making a speech. He sent gifts to widows of men who had died in earlier conflicts regardless of their alignment, leaving envelopes without names. These were not soft moves. They were practical gestures aimed at reminding the community that the Union, at its best, had concerned itself with such needs. If he could win hearts there, a vote might have to follow the will of those hearts. He also kept striking at the economic base of his enemies where he could do it without fireworks. In neighborhoods where he was strong, suppliers who worked with the other side sometimes found their deliveries delayed by paperwork or traffic that seemed to appear only on days when their vans needed a clear route. Friendly dock workers discovered that the easiest path off a rail car belonged to customers who had stayed neutral or who dealt with Joseph directly. It was unglamorous pressure, but over weeks it added up to leverage. In a world where bottles meant income, any hiccup that slowed the flow was felt in the cash box. Those who depended on that cash were quick to complain to their patrons, and patronage began to look more costly when the man in charge couldn't protect the pipeline. Travel east continued. Buffalo remained a trusted waypoint, a place where Sicilian shopkeepers and union men had built a network that spoke the same code Joseph did. He laid out his case to them with the same patience. If Chicago's Sicilian community decided its leadership independently, it would strengthen all Sicilian circles in America, because it would prove that an old-world institution could resist being bent to outside force. Sympathy often greeted this argument. Material help came in measured quantities. A handful of steady men agreed to resettle in Chicago for a stretch. Others offered introductions to practical talent with steady nerves. He accepted what he could get and sent word back when new arrivals were safely placed. At the same time, the opposite current moved against him. Men recruited from other cities to take a shot at the South Side boss rarely lasted long. News would reach him that a pair from New York had turned up in town, that they had been seen near a hotel lobby, and that by the afternoon they were nowhere to be found. He understood what that meant without needing details. The city he lived in knew how to hunt. He learned to assume that any new plan he drafted was already known to somebody he would never meet. That sobering assumption narrowed his options, but it also cleared his mind. He focused on what he could control: his schedule, his allies, the distribution of money, and the list of people who needed to be cared for. The courthouse lights stayed on late many nights that spring, as judges heard more weapons cases and illegal shipment cases than they had in years. Joseph's name appeared on dockets for minor counts that would have drawn little attention in quieter times. He moved through those with counsel beside him, and avoided making any statement that could be construed as an admission. He did not insult the officers who brought him in. He did not give them a reason to turn a routine stop into an excuse. His posture was always the same: a businessman who believed he had a legitimate claim to lead a community organization and who refused to be chased from that claim by men who did not belong to it. There were moments of near disaster. One afternoon, he left a short meeting in a walk-up on the west side and stepped into the back stairwell because the front hall had gone too still. He took 3 steps and heard shoes on metal above him. He backed into a laundry room, climbed through a window into a light well, and crossed into the neighboring building. He emerged 3 doors down as if he had been a tenant all along, nodded to a woman carrying groceries, and reached the street where a boy from his crew had been posted to watch for exactly such moments. That boy grew into a man who later told the story to reporters: quiet footsteps, a glance at a hinge, a choice that bought another week. In the midst of the chase, papers began to print that Joseph had finally been recognized as president of the Union by some circles within the organization. The claim was contested at once by his rivals, who put forward names backed by different rooms and different sets of signatures. For Joseph, even a partial acceptance meant something. It gave him a sliver of formal standing to go with the informal support he had spent years collecting. He used it to meet with bank clerks who handled community accounts, to examine lists of dues paid and benefits owed, and to make the kind of administrative decisions that gave a presidency weight in the eyes of ordinary members. Those actions, however modest, signaled that he would wield the office in the way he had promised, focused on mutual aid, not as a conduit for someone else's directives. The response was as swift as it was predictable. Unknown callers asked relatives where he slept. Familiar faces were glimpsed near corners where they had no honest business. A fruit seller who had always loaded crates with conversation suddenly had nothing to say when Joseph stopped by, his eyes fixed on a spot beyond the door. Warnings came from directions he hadn't expected: a city clerk, a man in a union office, a woman who worked in a bakery frequented by soldiers from the other side. The message was the same each time. They were coming harder now. He told his inner circle to pare his schedule to essentials, to cut every meeting that could be handled with a phone call, and to move the rest under cover of the busiest hours of the day. That forced simplicity sharpened the work. He drew up a list with 3 columns. The first carried names of the elders whose support had to be maintained. The second listed the men who managed key lanes of commerce and who required regular deliveries or cash to keep faith. The third named the outsiders, whose quiet backing gave him reach beyond city limits. He assigned a trusted lieutenant to each column and asked for nightly reports. It wasn't a grand plan. It was the only way to keep a complicated strain of obligations from tangling. Keeping those columns served him because it reminded him that his position rested on people who had chosen to stand with him for concrete reasons. If he continued to meet those reasons, he still had a chance. Summer approached with a pace that made even hardened men restless. Shifts in leadership at the Union had left the association fragile. Rival groups eyed each other across rooms where they once shared coffee without thinking twice. Joseph moved through the same streets with the same purpose, but the margin for error had compressed to almost nothing. He had made it far by calculating where pressure could be applied, by reading rooms, by persuading elders that he would hold the line on tradition. Now he confronted the part of the story where persuasion alone would not determine the ending. He accepted that reality without surrendering the argument that had carried him this far. He was close enough to touch the chair he had pursued, and the city had narrowed the space in which he could move. It was a combination he had always known could not last. He chose to press forward anyway, telling himself that the only way to end a struggle like this was not to leave it behind, but to win it in the open. Summer pressed down on Chicago with heat that softened asphalt and shortened tempers, but Joseph kept the same rhythm he'd been refining for months. Public calm, private speed, He had reached the point where the Unione's presidency wasn't just a rumor whispered in courtyards. Enough members had pledged to him that he could act like a man who would soon hold the seal. He started to do small, practical things that signaled a shift. Widows' stipends resumed. Medical bills were paid from dues, rather than from envelopes whose origin no one could trace. The benefits committee met twice a week, instead of once. He made sure those changes reached the ears of elders who valued the old purpose of the association. When a grocer's son broke a leg, the boy's father found rent covered for a month, a doctor's fee paid, and a note that said only, "From your friends at the hall." That was the language Joseph wanted the Union to speak again. He had chosen his moment carefully. A headline in late spring announced that the man he had fought for years had been picked up in another state and handed a sentence for a weapons offense that would keep him away for a stretch. Even a short absence changed the city's mathematics. The network that backed Joseph's rival still functioned, but the center of gravity had shifted. Joseph read that gap as room to take steps he had postponed. He brought in a bookkeeper who knew how to separate legitimate dues from the kind of deposits that drew attention. He asked a priest who understood the community's history to bless a modest ceremony marking a return to ordinary service work. He did not hold a parade. He didn't need one. Quiet proof of competence mattered more than banners. He also tightened the practical side of his operations. Sugar and yeast remained the lifeblood of many clients' businesses. He had long-standing leverage in those markets, and he used it with care. Suppliers who relied on lanes he protected continued to enjoy fewer delays. New buyers received fair prices if they respected the arrangements that kept trucks moving without collisions. A distributor who tried to cut around him found that a few crucial doors stopped opening on time. No one slammed those doors. They just failed to unlock until a conversation restored balance. It was pressure, but it was measured. He wanted revenue without theatrics. Every day still carried risk. He settled into an office in a plain building where no one would expect to find a president. Visitors entered through a side stairwell and left in pairs. Instructions were delivered with as few words as possible. Lists were short and clear. A delivery here, a meeting there, a message to an elder, a lawyer for a young man caught in a sweep. He kept his inner group small and expected them to behave like quiet professionals, not like men chasing headlines. They understood that their best chance at stability came from making Joseph's presidency feel inevitable to ordinary members, predictable enough that even opponents would grow tired of fighting it. Across town, resistance never slept. The faction that had backed his rivals selected yet another placeholder at the Union and pushed his name forward with confidence. Joseph answered by walking the same blocks he had walked for years, shaking the same hands, keeping appointments at cafes where he had sat since before the feud turned hot. He said what he'd always said. Leadership should come from the members, not from a man who didn't belong to the club. That simple contrast still carried weight. He was careful not to crow about the change in momentum brought on by his rival's absence. He knew better than anyone that absence did not mean weakness. It meant that more responsibility had fallen on lieutenants, who would feel obliged to prove their worth. He kept up contact with out-of-town allies. The men in Buffalo respected his patience and his emphasis on tradition. They signaled approval without fanfare. A few sent steady hands to help with security and errands. He housed them in clean rooms and paid them without delay, a habit that bought loyalty the same way punctuality had bought him his reputation in the cheese trade. From New York came advice wrapped in anecdotes. Quiet is the best armor. Never schedule two things you can't cancel in the same hour. Treat priests and teachers like royalty, because they carry a kind of shield even your rivals won't test lightly. He followed most of that counsel, adjusted the rest to fit Chicago. He also faced the cost of years spent issuing offers he could never retract. The sums he had put on rival heads had moved like electricity through the underworld. Reporters repeated figures that made headlines. Police memoranda listed names and numbers in neat columns, and ordinary citizens debated whether anyone could survive a campaign so open. Joseph couldn't turn those offers back into paper. He could only try to lower the temperature by acting like a man who had no need of further escalations because his position rested on consent rather than fear. He said as much to the elders. "We don't have to keep bleeding to run our own club." Some nodded. Some stared back, unconvinced that the fight could be settled without a final reckoning. He refused to live as a ghost. He ate at a small table in the back of a restaurant that had served his family for years, arriving without notice and leaving before dessert. He stopped by a fruit stand run by a widow and lifted a crate with his own hands, joking about how he had more practice with cheese than peaches. Those moments mattered because they were the opposite of a secret life. He wanted his people to see that leadership could still look like ordinary manners. At the same time, he never sat near a window and never accepted a plate unless it had come from a kitchen he trusted. A bodyguard once reached for a fork before Joseph did and took a bite as if that were the most natural gesture in the world. They laughed, but the message was clear. Care wasn't paranoia. It was survival. Rumors of ambushes didn't stop. One morning, a boy from his crew spotted a face in a mirror across the street that didn't match the reflection. Joseph rescheduled 3 meetings and used a different apartment for a week. He treated the city like a chessboard, choosing moves that kept him one space from the next trap. He was not reckless. He was persistent. Friends urged a long trip east until the atmosphere eased. He refused because presence remained his strongest argument. You cannot claim to lead a neighborhood you will not walk through. The courthouse was a second home that summer. He faced charges for small offenses that kept pressure on him without producing a trial that might force either acquittal or jail time. Concealed weapons, a licensing infraction, a fine for a delivery that was a block off a permitted route. He paid, walked out, returned to work. The repetition was the point. Officers wanted him tired and distracted. He chose to treat each summons as a cost of doing business during a season when change was within reach. A detective, more weary than hostile, told him in the hallway that no one could run between raindrops forever. Joseph answered that some men learned to do it long enough to reach the next awning. He kept reshaping the unione from the inside. He formed small committees by district, each with 1 elder and 2 younger men who could manage errands and handle disputes before they grew into feuds. He revived a loan fund for shopkeepers that charged modest interest and required collateral in the form of reputations rather than property. Borrowers needed 2 signatures from respected members. Anyone who defaulted lost more than a deposit he lost standing. That old method worked because shame traveled quickly in a community built on names. He also set aside a portion of dues for legal defense so that a single arrest would not push a family into debt. These decisions were quiet, administrative, almost dull. They were also exactly the kind of work that distinguished a club from a crew. North Side contacts remained useful, even after the massacre that had shocked the city months earlier. Surviving leaders had reasons to keep pressure on the South Side. They and Joseph still shared lookouts and sometimes swapped spare drivers. They used each other without illusions. When a route grew hot for one group, the other picked up a piece of it for a week, then handed it back once the glare faded. That kind of cooperation kept money flowing and avoided the kind of collisions that wasted resources neither side could afford if they hoped to hold ground against a larger machine. He heard that his enemies had begun to study his new habits as closely as they'd studied his old ones. They knew he visited his mother at odd hours. They knew he preferred certain blocks because sightlines comforted him. They guessed which church doors he favored. Knowing that they knew, he set decoys in motion. A cousin left by one door, while he left by another. A driver switched hats with him in a crowded stairwell, while 3 men watched from a doorway and left believing they had seen Joseph step into a car that drove in the wrong direction. He seldom enjoyed these tricks. He used them because they bought hours, and hours bought chances to finish the work he had started inside the club. A few of the men he'd recruited from out of town were picked up by police within days of their arrival. It was a pattern he learned to expect. He prepared envelopes for bail, retained counsel in advance, and told the newcomers that arrests didn't mean they had failed. They meant the city had eyes everywhere. The ones who stayed after that first jolt were worth twice what they cost because they didn't spook at every knock. He placed them on errands that required steadiness, delivering messages to elders, escorting widows to the bank, watching a doorway for an hour without staring like a man watching a doorway. As summer began to fade, his public standing reached a peak. Newspapers wrote that he had finally been recognized as president by enough sections of the Union to make it more than a claim. Rival statements denied it, but the way money moved told its own story. Dues were paid to clerks loyal to Joseph. Calls about benefits came to his office. Disputes over territory within the association landed on his desk because both sides expected an answer. that would stick. He handled those cases with patience, always bringing one elder into the room, always emphasizing that the unione existed to calm conflicts, not to inflame them. He recorded outcomes in neat handwriting that would have looked familiar to anyone who remembered him as a young trader keeping grocery ledgers in Utica. With recognition came a heavier target on his back. The warnings grew more frequent and specific. A barber told him that a man he did not know had offered to pay triple for a shave at an exact hour on an exact day, just the time Joseph liked to stop by. A janitor whispered that a door in a hall where Joseph often met had been oiled that morning, though it had always squeaked. A woman who sold flowers near a church where he sometimes prayed said 2 men had asked if that was the spot where a certain gentleman liked to light a candle. He thanked each of them, pressed money into their palms they didn't want to take, and made small adjustments that turned traps into wasted effort. He remained, however, a man who had made enemies longer than some of his drivers had been alive. Those enemies commanded patient resources. They didn't need to hurry. They only needed to study. He knew it and chose to live in motion anyway. Part of it was pride, part of it was duty. He had told too many elders, too many shopkeepers, too many widows that he would not walk away. He believed that victory would cut the cost of the feud. He believed that a stable presidency would give young men a path other than into the kind of work that had taken so many of their cousins. Whether those hopes were realistic mattered less to him than the fact that they were promises he had made in rooms where men wept and women held photographs of the dead. You either carried such promises, or you didn't. During those weeks, he made one more run east, speaking again with men who watched Chicago with a calm eye. They told him he had gone as far as a man can go by arguing from tradition alone. If he intended to see his tenure survive, he needed to lock down 2 things: a reliable flow of money that didn't depend on a single commodity, and a security cordon built around ordinary life rather than around theatrical shows of force. He returned with both suggestions in mind. He moved modest sums into fruit and produced partnerships that would still make money if the city tightened its grip on sugar shipments. He also widened his ring of guardians to include men who looked like clerks, porters, and delivery boys. They were easier to miss, and they saw more because people talked freely around them. The city changed course again just as leaves started to turn. A stream of out-of-town hitters showed up and vanished faster than they could unpack, a sign that the other side's reach remained steady even while its leader was away. Police chiefs, under pressure from City Hall, floated plans for new raids and visible patrols meant to calm the public. Joseph heard those speeches and planned around them. He cut meetings in half. He traveled earlier in the day, when the streets were crowded and gunfire would draw too much attention. He traded late-night sessions for afternoon walks that looked like errands. Even with those adjustments, the path narrowed. He felt it in the way conversations ended sooner, in the way smiles thinned when he stepped into a room, in the way a driver flinched at a car backfiring 2 blocks away. He had a choice to make. He could step back and let the title float for a month, send word through intermediaries, and spare himself a few close calls. He rejected it because his name had finally taken on the weight he intended. His signatures on benefit slips, his decisions in small disputes, his presence at baptisms and funerals, those were not optics. They were the office itself. To step back would be to turn that office back into a rumor. He doubled down on routines that connected him to the members who had put their trust in him. He still spent an hour now and then with his ledgers, a habit he never lost. Numbers tell the truth in a way talk does not. He could see which districts were paying on time, which families needed help again, which lanes produced steady income without unusual attention. The pages told him his position was stronger than it had been a year earlier. They also warned him that the cushion wasn't thick enough to absorb a long siege. He didn't need a siege. He needed 6 more months of calm to make the changes self-sustaining. He suspected he would be granted far less. For all his care, life has a way of setting its own clocks. A late summer day drifted into evening with meetings finished on time, short walks uneventful, drivers calm. He allowed himself a minute in a quiet room, hat on the table, hands folded, a breath taken without hurry. The next day's list looked manageable: a visit to an elder who had been ill, a look at a warehouse lease, a small ceremony for a fund that helped orphans of members. Routine, the kind of schedule that keeps a city family together. He stood, put on his hat, and stepped back into motion, unaware that somewhere nearby men he had never met had already begun to agree on corners, windows, and clocks. Autumn crept in while the city tried to pretend it hadn't noticed. Markets still hummed, streetcars clattered, boys shouted baseball scores, but the air had an edge, and Joseph felt it in his bones. He had used the long stretch of his rival's absence to turn promises into small facts, stipends paid, disputes settled, committees formed. Now word reached him that the South Side's anchor had been released from that Philadelphia sentence and had returned to direct things in person. No one needed to say what that meant. A machine that had moved with a steady rhythm would start hitting the gas again. Joseph didn't waste breath on speeches about it. He doubled his attention to two fronts. Keep the Union busy doing the quiet work of a mutual aid club, and make sure his routes and apartments were as clean as habits allowed. Recognition inside the association had grown from whispers into something you could point to. Clerks balanced ledgers with his sign-off. District elders stopped by to ask for rulings on neighborhood arguments. Widows who had waited months for help found envelopes without an apology, only a promise that the wait would not become a custom. He worked to keep those proofs from turning into headlines. The last thing he needed was to push his standing in the papers. He wanted older men to feel that the club had finally returned to routine, the kind of routine that makes a city feel like a village again. Security shifted with the season. The men assigned to watch him still carried themselves like cousins at a picnic, but the choreography sharpened. They arrived in pairs, walked a few steps apart, and never both looked in the same direction. A driver practiced pulling to the curb without jerking, because even small mistakes draw eyes. A boy posted outside a back stairwell learned to read reflections in a shop window instead of staring at a doorway. These were not grand maneuvers. They were small disciplines that let a man cross a street and keep a promise later that afternoon. He didn't stop working the economic angles that had kept his side funded. Yeast and sugar continued to move because they were necessary for people's plans, whether the city liked those plans or not. He bargained with suppliers and buyers like the grocer he had once been, cutting pennies where he could, forgiving a late payment when loyalty deserved it, nudging a stubborn customer with a reminder that roads were safer when certain men agreed to keep them safe. He also diversified, investing a portion of income in produce partnerships and dry goods so that he wouldn't be exposed if a rail yard suddenly turned unfriendly. Those changes weren't dramatic, but they were a hedge against the kind of squeeze the other side could apply when it wanted to make someone's week go bad. The pressure campaign came back with its old force. Patrol cars idled a little longer near places he liked to visit. Weapons sweeps multiplied. Judges stayed late. He walked the same halls with the same lawyers and the same patients. Fines, suspended sentences, a promise to appear, a quiet exit through a side door. A reporter once asked whether he was tired of the routine. He answered with a shrug that looked careless on purpose and said a man who pays his bills doesn't get to complain about receipts. It wasn't bravado. It was a decision to accept friction as part of the road. He kept the Unione's voice steady and practical. Loan committees met on Tuesdays and Fridays. Benefits were logged with dates and initials. A simple rule guided most decisions: solve problems at the smallest level possible. If two shopkeepers argued over deliveries, he put them in a room with an elder and didn't let them leave without an agreement written on a single sheet. If a driver's temper threatened to pull families into a feud, he made sure the driver found work out of the district for a while. These were dull decisions to outsiders. They were the work that had to be done for his claim to leadership to mean anything. Across town, his enemies did their own housekeeping. Men who had wavered the year before were reminded which payroll signed their envelopes. Out of town, arrivals checked into hotels and checked out without explanations. A few tried to reach Joseph through mutual acquaintances, offering inside information in exchange for a place to land. He accepted some of those offers with care and turned others away because a bargain that looks too neat usually isn't neat at all. He had learned in the last year that a leak wasn't always a hole. Sometimes it was a lure. A familiar name from the East called with a congratulation delivered like a verdict. Certain rooms now considered him the proper head of the Union in Chicago. The remark was offered quietly, without ceremony, as if a ledger had been balanced. It told him his long campaign for recognition had finally stretched beyond neighborhood boundaries. It also complicated his life. A title that once felt like a shield also felt like a target. With that nod came expectations he could not ignore. He would have to prove he could hold the office and still make the city livable for the men and families who had backed him. He marked the moment without fanfare. He signed a donation for a parish school, wrote a letter to an elder in poor health, and arranged for a clerk to visit a widow instead of asking her to travel across town. He was not trying to charm anyone. He was trying to show them that power didn't always arrive with a parade. A farmer counts proof in harvests. A community counts proof in groceries delivered and doctors paid. He didn't erase his past. The bounties he had put on his rivals persisted in rumor and in old memos. Even after he stopped talking about such offers, they lived on in the minds of men who had heard them. Those memories kept the circle around him tight because they ensured there would be no forgiveness if he stumbled into the wrong doorway alone. He accepted the consequence. He had made the fight public, and public fights don't end neatly. The season after his rival's return brought more close calls. Once, stepping out of a storefront at noon, he saw a car across the boulevard with its rear window lowered just enough to be useful. He paused to greet a man he didn't know, a tiny delay that let a streetcar slide between him and the line of sight. He took the long way around the block, stopped to buy a pie he didn't want, and reached his car 2 minutes later than planned. The supposed coincidence was logged by a boy with a sharp pencil and a list of plates that would later be compared against sightings from 3 other corners. The pattern revealed itself like a smudge under tracing paper. He changed his habits again. The city's crime commission issued another of its lists, this one decorated with numbers that suggested a rank no one had voted on. Joseph's name climbed high enough to draw fresh attention. He didn't frame the notice. He treated it like a weather report. The wind had shifted. Wear a heavier coat. He kept his head down in public places and didn't linger where a photographer could ambush him with a flash and a question that needed a quote. He considered a public statement insisting that his work inside the Union was lawful. He dismissed the idea before it formed. In Chicago, words like lawful and unlawful meant less than who could protect whom on a weekday afternoon. He kept looking outward because Chicago was never an island. On the East Coast, men with old country pedigrees were engaged in a struggle for primacy, with consequences that reached into every city where Sicilians had built associations. Joseph visited a few of them one last time. He offered the same argument he had rehearsed for years. A Sicilian club in Chicago should answer to its members, and if it did, every similar club would be stronger everywhere. The answers he received came in nods, in careful sentences, in a willingness to take his calls. He didn't leave those rooms with bags of cash or promises of soldiers. He left with something that mattered more to him: patience from men whose opinions, when spoken in the right ear, could cool a situation instead of fanning it. Spring gave way to a summer he knew would be the hardest of his life. Capone's circle tightened, arrests spiked, and men Joseph had counted on had to juggle their jobs with court dates they didn't deserve. He paid for lawyers where he could, and made sure families didn't starve while a case dragged on. That choice cost money he would rather have put into business, but he knew the cheaper mistake would have been to let fear do the collecting. The men around him needed to see that the association's promise wasn't conditional on good luck. He adapted in small ways that didn't feel like surrender. Late-night meetings became afternoon visits during the busiest hours when the streets provided cover no wall could. Private apartments gave way to back rooms in busy restaurants, whose owners had known him since the early days. He avoided buildings with only one exit. He refused to meet on upper floors, unless he could choose the stairwell. These weren't tricks. They were habits born of a life that had taught him to stay near a door and to trust a second path. The Union kept breathing because he insisted on it. He added a scholarship fund for children of members who wanted to finish school beyond 8th grade. He sent 2 mechanics to repair a delivery van for a family that had given the association more volunteer hours than anyone else on their block. He signed off on a visit by a doctor to the home of a bedbound elder who had once been the loudest voice against him, because dignity didn't depend on a vote. Acts like that did more for his standing than any speech could have, and he knew it. He didn't advertise them. Word traveled on its own. Northside contacts still took his calls. They measured time and deliveries and avoided the kind of big gestures that drew heat. If a truck needed to cross a block where the other side's watchers lounged too comfortably, somebody whistled and 2 routes were swapped for a day. If an alley grew risky because a window suddenly felt occupied even when it looked empty, a lookout was reassigned before trouble appeared. Those arrangements were not friendship, and no one pretended otherwise. They were the arithmetic of surviving under a pressure that never quite let up. The months slid toward fall, and the city's calendar filled with festivals, parades, and school openings. Those public events gave cover and posed danger in equal measure. Joseph attended a handful, showing his face at the edge of a crowd, murmuring a greeting to a priest, slipping away before the first speeches ended. A photograph from that season shows him tipping his hat to an elderly woman as boys chase a ball in the background. He looks like a man who has found a calm he knew was temporary. The picture circulated because people wanted to believe that normal life still existed around the edges of a contest that had consumed too much. His rivals didn't need to meet that hope halfway. They had patience and time and men who could wait in a car the way fishermen can wait on a riverbank for a fish that's already taken the bait. Joseph knew it. He answered with the only tool he trusted more than nerves work. He kept the Union busy enough that momentum itself felt like a shield. When you spend your days answering calls about broken pipes and school shoes and rent, you run out of hours to spiral into drama. He wanted that for his members. He wanted it for himself. Warnings continued to arrive from improbable places. A bank clerk said 2 strangers had asked which afternoons were quietest at a branch near a hall Joseph used for small meetings. A confectioner reported that a man with soft hands and an expensive watch had asked whether Joseph favored chocolate or lemon when he bought candy for his nieces and nephews. A boy who shined shoes near a train station swore he had heard a man say a street name he'd never heard adults say before. Joseph thanked them all and adjusted one more set of appointments, changed one more route, kept moving. The first week of October opened with a sun that reached beyond what the month usually allowed. He took it as an excuse to walk instead of ride between 2 short meetings. A dry cleaner sent out a clerk with a garment exactly when he passed the door. An accidental block that irritated his bodyguard and probably saved his life. The delay meant a corner he normally reached at 1:30 was still 2 minutes ahead. A car turned that corner, slowed, saw nothing worth seeing, and kept going. Joseph reached the spot later, bought a newspaper he didn't want, and folded it under his arm. The day progressed the way ordinary days do. A conversation about dues, a decision about a shipment, a note to an elder thanking him for turning out volunteers for a charity drive. He slept that night in a different apartment than the one his enemies expected. In the morning, he sent a boy to pick up a package from a tailor. The boy came back pale and breathless. He had noticed a man carrying a stack of old newspapers who never turned a page. Joseph didn't say anything dramatic. He took his hat, canceled 2 visits, made a 3rd, then sent money and apologies for the missed appointments, along with a promise to make up the time. He was not going to stop being present. He was going to be more careful about how presence looked from a window across the street. A few days later, he met with a city official who asked carefully, without a recorder on the desk, why he didn't leave Chicago for a year and conduct his club work by letter. Joseph smiled without showing a trace of mockery, and said a man who conducts Chicago business by letter ends up a man with no business. The official sighed and changed the subject to the price of bread. They spoke for 20 minutes, and both left, knowing nothing was going to change except the weather. As the month advanced, 2 men he didn't know were picked up near a flat associated with his circle. Their statements made the rounds in rumor before the police records caught up. They had arrived by a night train, checked into a hotel under simple names, and spent 2 days staring at the wrong door because Joseph had shifted his route an hour earlier on a tip. They kept their silence out of habit rather than loyalty. Joseph heard the story and felt the old mix of satisfaction and fatigue. Outmaneuvering danger buys another day. It does not buy a guarantee. He held on to ordinary rituals because routine sets the rhythm a life needs to stay steady. He visited his mother and sat with her longer than usual, talking about nothing anyone would call important. Bread, the neighbor's cat, a cousin's child who had started school. He carried groceries up the stairs instead of letting one of his men do it. He wrote to a former partner in Utica to ask whether a shared customer had paid his debts. He checked a ledger and circled a number he didn't like. He told a driver to take a different bridge because he didn't like the way a certain intersection felt at that hour. He was by then the kind of figure a city invents when it wants to explain itself to itself. To some, he was proof that immigrant stubbornness can wear down anything. To others, he was a lesson in what happens when a man challenges a machine and remains on his feet longer than common sense says he should. He didn't ask for either reading. He asked for time and used it the way he had always used it. Pay the bills, keep promises, adjust the plan, repeat. The days stretching toward late October carried the hush people learned to recognize without being able to describe. Jokes landed softer. Radios were turned down when certain names came on. He could feel the town leaning forward, as if waiting for a cue that was already written somewhere he couldn't see. He carried on anyway, not because he liked tempting fate, but because stopping would have meant admitting that his opponents were the only ones who got to schedule his life. A calendar page turned. He stood in front of a mirror and straightened his tie, not as a performance, but as a habit. The day's agenda was simple. Check on a family who had suffered a loss, review a contract for a small warehouse space, sit with an elder recovering from an illness that had scared everyone more than they let on. He planned to take the quieter streets and to keep his stops short. He picked up his hat. Somewhere nearby, someone else picked up a set of keys and glanced at a timetable they had studied long enough to recite in their sleep. The city inhaled. He stepped into the hallway and started down the stairs. He took each step like a man measuring distance rather than time. The driver waited in a quiet car around the corner. Another pair watched the sidewalk for faces that didn't belong. And a boy studied the reflections in a storefront window the way men read newspapers. Joseph had lived through enough close calls to recognize the way a day feels when the air goes thin. He made 2 stops in the morning all the same. The first visit was to an elder recovering from an illness who needed to hear that benefits would keep coming without delay. The second was a short session over a warehouse lease, where he underlined a clause that would keep a delivery lane under neutral control. Both tasks were ordinary. He liked ordinary because it gave proof that the Unione still existed for reasons that had nothing to do with feuds. By early afternoon, he moved to a modest office tucked above a tailor shop on the west side. It was the kind of place where a man could pass unnoticed if he kept his hat low and his steps even. He went over lists, signed a handful of benefit slips, sent a note to a parish school with a small donation, and spoke with a bookkeeper about putting a little more into a relief fund for members out of work. He was careful with money. Even then, years of counting cheese orders in Utica and Chicago had built a habit he never dropped. Numbers first, then talk. Warnings kept finding him from directions he didn't expect. A janitor, a barber, a boy from the shoeshine stand each had seen something off by a doorway he used, or a corner he preferred. He thanked them, told his guards to tighten up, and shuffled appointments again. He walked from the tailor's stairwell into a hallway that emptied onto a side street, past a florist, and stepped into the kind of late-season sun Chicago gives you as a favor before the wind comes back. He didn't linger. He crossed to a cafe where the owner knew to pour coffee without questions and to leave the back door unlatched in case a fast exit was needed. He lived with the reality that his rivals had returned to full strength. The sentence that had kept the South Side's anchor in Philadelphia was over. The machine ran smoother because its center was back in the room. Joseph adjusted. He put more of his trust in quiet aides who could blend into sidewalks, cut meetings into smaller pieces, and insisted on 2 exits for any room where he sat longer than 5 minutes. He was not trying to look clever. He was trying to live long enough to make his leadership inside the Union permanent. That leadership, by then, was recognized in more than whispers. Clerks took dues with his approval. Loan committees reported to him on set days. Elders who had once doubted called him to mediate small fights over stalls and delivery times. In private, out-of-town figures told him they considered him the head of Chicago's Sicilian Association. The words arrived without ceremony, like the settling of dust after a long day. He neither celebrated nor announced it. He understood that the quiet nod mattered more than a headline, and also that a quiet nod makes you visible to the wrong eyes. He had changed some habits to lower the heat. He stopped repeating routes, skipped night meetings when he could manage with an afternoon walk, and met with North Side contacts only in rooms with more than one door. That alliance remained practical rather than sentimental. It was built on shared interests. Move goods efficiently, keep lookouts smart, avoid collisions that would only help the other side. He also kept a pragmatic focus on the money that paid for everything. Yeast, sugar, produce, dry goods. Diversifying his income streams meant he could keep people fed and lawyers paid even when police pressure spiked. The truth is, he had always mixed rule-breaking with mutual aid. Police files, court notes, and newspaper columns across the years had recorded his offers to remove enemies, the bribes he laid out for waiters and cooks when he thought poison might achieve what bullets would only inflame, the bounties that looked reckless even to hard men. He had used intimidation to collect from suppliers who traveled on protected routes. He had paid for out-of-town help and arranged for safe apartments. He had carried weapons without permits and instructed drivers to change plates when a sweep was expected. Those acts were real, and they defined him as much as his care for widows and his patience with elders. He never pretended otherwise. He told himself, and anyone who asked in private, that he had chosen a hard road because softer roads ended with someone else giving orders inside an association he believed belonged to its members. The city had put him on a list that summer, a ranking meant to show the public who stood where in Chicago's shadow economy. His name sat near the top, behind only one man. He treated the notice like another kind of weather. It changed nothing about how he walked. What changed his walk were the faces he didn't know, the cars that idled too long, and the way doors suddenly swung easier in buildings that had always had stiff hinges. Those details told him that the patience of his enemies had not thinned, it had sharpened. Near the end of October, he visited a friend in a West Side flat not far from a candy shop, where a man could place a call without drawing attention. The plan was simple. A short talk, a quick walk, a car to the next stop. He stepped inside, exchanged a few words, checked his watch, and decided to leave before the street got quiet. He adjusted his hat, told his guards to give him a few steps of space, and headed toward the stairs. Someone across the way had been watching that door long enough to memorize the rhythm of how it opened and closed. He reached the sidewalk, paused long enough to glance both ways, and took 5 strides toward the corner where he intended to hail a car. The street looked ordinary at first glance, children's chalk lines, a woman with a shopping bag, a man reading, but the stillness inside the movement bothered him. He cut his pace a fraction, as if to tie his shoelace with his eyes. In that heartbeat, the plan crafted by men he had never met came into motion. Windows that had seemed empty weren't. A car that had been parked across the way for an hour without a driver suddenly mattered. His bodyguards reacted as trained men react when a scene turns. They moved to shield him, guided him toward the nearest doorway, and tried to clutter the angle of sight with their own shoulders. He turned, looked for a path up a stairwell, and did what he had done 100 times. Chose motion over stasis. Noise filled the block, bright and ugly but brief. He aimed for the nearest cover. People close by did what people do in such moments. Some crouched, some ran, some froze. Within breaths, the air settled. A door that had once seemed friendly now felt far away. Accounts written that afternoon never agreed on the sequence down to the second. Some witnesses swore he stumbled near a stoop. Others said he reached a stairwell and tried to take the steps 2 at a time. Everyone agreed that his guards fired in return, and that the men who had staged the ambush vanished the way professionals vanish, when a plan allows no lingering. The street's texture returned, but it returned changed, because the man at the center of the fight over the Union was no longer standing in it. Police arrived fast. A patrolman who had been 2 blocks away sprinted the last stretch, followed by detectives in coats who had memorized Joseph's file years earlier. They found evidence of close work. Spent shells, scuff marks, faces in windows, unsure whether to admit what they had seen. Officers spread out, asked for names, logged plates, took notes on paper that rustled against the wind. They knew, as they worked, that the city would read whatever they wrote with hungry eyes. Reporters followed as close as uniformed men would allow. Names were muttered, numbers guessed, blame assigned without hesitation by people who had been sure for years that events would end this way. News traveled with a speed only fear can match. Phones rang in club rooms, in kitchens, in back offices where a clerk kept a radio turned low. A boy ran to tell an elder who sank into a chair and stared at a spot that wasn't there. A grocer stepped outside and turned his sign to closed without thinking about receipts. A priest who had always kept a careful neutrality said a prayer in a corner, and then called 2 families who needed to hear the news from a familiar voice, rather than from a headline shouted at a streetcar stop. Editors filled columns that evening with the story they had been rehearsing in their heads. They wrote about the cheese importer, who had turned himself into a rival, strong enough to worry the largest outfit in the city. They wrote about the Unione, once a safety net and then a stage on which men with different visions of power had argued with more than words. They wrote about attempts on lives, about bribes offered for dishes that never left the kitchen, about alliances with North Siders, about trips to Buffalo and New York, where patient men with old country ties measured his case and sometimes nodded. They wrote about bounties that had teased headlines out of thin air. They wrote, too, about envelopes dropped at widows' doors, hospital bills covered, funerals attended with hat in hand and voice low, because the city had always seen more than one face when it looked at Joseph. The Union's rooms, already tense for months, went silent for a beat and then filled with movement. Paperwork needed signatures. Benefits couldn't wait. A club exists Because it does routine work. He had tried to prove that simple point every day he carried the title. Now the people who had backed him had to decide whether his work would survive him. Some men feared the cost of trying. Others refused to let the association drift back into being a lever pulled by someone who never paid dues. Within days, a slate aligned with the South Side stepped forward, and the message was clear. The fight you were living through is over. Let the city breathe. In public, the transition looked orderly. In private, it felt like a page torn from a ledger before the total could be entered. Police rounded up his known allies for questioning. Drivers, clerks, cousins, anyone who had stood near him in a doorway that year, spent hours repeating the same details for men who already knew the outlines by heart. Some were charged with small offenses. Most were released with warnings. The tactic was familiar. Shake the tree, see what falls. The North Side took its own measure. They had lost friends that winter in a garage the country still talked about. They gauged whether Joseph's death meant they should press or pause. Most chose to survive first and decide later. The way hard survivors do when a city keeps moving no matter who falls. Out of town, the news landed in rooms where decisions about American Sicilian circles were being made in a season of upheaval. East Coast bosses were fighting a war of their own, and they had not expected the Chicago figure they had recently nodded through as a local head to be erased so quickly. Some read it as proof that the South Side's chief still held his city from end to end. Others sighed and moved on because their calendars were crowded with local battles. If Joseph was remembered in those rooms, it was as a man who had asked for independence for his association and paid the price the powerful often exact from those who test their reach. For his family, the aftermath was simpler and heavier than any headline. Brothers and cousins gathered in small spaces, closed shades, spoke softly to children, decided who would handle which obligations. A funeral was arranged with the caution that attends any ceremony where people worry that a crowd might invite the wrong kind of attention. The service was respectful. Priests spoke in the way clergy speak when they know that everyone in the room carries a version of a story they cannot reconcile with each other. On the street outside, passers-by slowed but didn't stop. The city has a way of absorbing shocks and putting them into the stream of daily life without losing a step. What remained when the first wave of noise passed were facts that don't end with one man. He had built a business that had mixed groceries and shipping with risks tied to prohibition. He had taken part in a campaign to control an association he believed should be run by its members. He had ordered, or at least set in motion, attacks on rivals, Lombardo fallen on a loop sidewalk, then Lolordo at his home months later. He had placed money on the removal of the South Side boss more than once, told cooks and waiters he would change their fortunes for a quiet act, and brought in writers of violence from other cities who rarely survived Chicago's talent for turning the tables. He had also paid hospital bills, put envelopes in hands that needed them, and insisted on the dull work of committees that solved problems before they turned into blood debts. Those contradictions defined him because they defined the city as it was in those years. From the South Side's point of view, Joseph's death closed a book. The man who had pressed hardest to free the Union from their orbit was gone. Their appointments could proceed, their routes could be guarded with fewer surprises, their meetings could be held without looking over their shoulders for a challenger who refused to yield. Even so, the victory cost energy. For 2 years they had spent resources watching him, countering his offers, intercepting his recruits, clearing the lanes he tried to block. Once the pressure eased, they turned back to business without the constant worry that a Sicilian council across town might produce a new rival with a mandate. If you step back and look at his path, you see a line that starts in a small Sicilian town, runs through grocery counters in Utica, reaches Chicago's markets, and then enters a ring where money, pride, and community loyalty pull in different directions. He didn't drift into that ring. He walked in with a plan and kept pushing it even after the costs were plain. He was stubborn in a way that can look like courage from one angle and like folly from another. He believed that a club built to help a specific immigrant community should not be harnessed to a leader who didn't come from that community, and that the quickest way to make that argument count was to act, not to beg. Acting in his era meant breaking laws born of a national experiment that had turned bottles into gold and turned men into counters who kept score with more than pencils. Chicago remembers him in pieces. In one memory, he's the cheese man who paid on time and knew how to calm hot heads. In another, He's the rival who posted prices on lives and brought strangers into town with sad confidence. In still another, he's the face at the back of a church who slipped out without waiting for thanks after covering a doctor's visit. Historians fit those pieces into larger puzzles about power and migration, about how mutual aid groups become political instruments, about how prohibition reshaped a city's street-level economy. His story fits any of those frames without losing its specific shape. He tried to carve out a zone of independence in a map already claimed by a machine built to erase such zones. As the first cold days of late fall settled over the lakefront, the block where he fell returned to its regular noises. Children chalked again. Drivers complained about traffic. Radios carried ball games and sermons. A man walking that way a week later would have had to look hard to find a mark that told him the neighborhood had held its breath one afternoon. That's how cities work. They hold grief briefly and then move because they must. In the Unione's rooms, fresh officers signed forms with tidy signatures. In courthouses, cases that had waited on his name moved forward or were quietly dropped. In other cities, men who had once taken his calls removed his number from slips of paper and tucked away their thoughts for the next visitor with a case to make. What endures are the promises he made and the arguments he carried. He pushed a claim that leadership should flow up from members rather than down from an outsider's desk. He believed that a club could remain a shield, even when the world around it demanded that it become a lever. He used both charity and coercion to advance that claim. For a time, he made it feel true. Then the city reclaimed its balance the way strong systems do when challenged by a single person. The end was fast, but the run that led to it was long and deliberate, built from grocery ledgers, careful alliances, unwise wagers on violence, patient care for neighbors, and confidence that he could bend an institution back toward its first purpose. Whether he succeeded depends on which corner you stand on when you tell the story, but no one who watched those years closely would say he failed to leave a shape where he stood. In the first days after the street fell quiet, the city did what it always does. It swept, it talked, it argued, and then it adjusted. Officers filled reports, editors filled columns, and men who had spent 2 years studying Joseph's habits studied a new map without his roots on it. Word moved fast across the neighborhoods that mattered most to him. The club's clerks came in early to open drawers and find ledgers where he'd left them. Benefits that he had approved were paid on schedule, because the widows shouldn't have been asked to wait for anyone's grief to settle. Drivers took a day off, and then went back to work, because deliveries don't stop for funerals. His brothers and cousins handled the calls, sent thanks to those who needed it, and kept private tears private. Out on the south side, the victory was marked with a shrug more than a celebration. The rival he had challenged for years did not need to stand in a doorway to be felt in one. Orders could travel by telephone. The association that Joseph had tried to free from outside control was steered back toward a slate that answered to the same orbit it had answered to before. A new set of names appeared on meeting notices. Dues were collected in the usual rooms. People outside the circle saw an organization return to routine. People inside it understood what that routine meant, and had always meant. A club built for mutual aid, nudged and pulled by forces larger than any single officer. A week later, markets across the country collapsed. Radios carried the panic with the same urgency they had carried stories from Chicago's streets. In the span of days, the Great Depression began, and a city that had spent years measuring itself by the contests of men like Joseph had to start measuring bread, rent, and winter. That shift did not erase the underground economy, but it changed the way people talked about it. Families who had once spoken only in whispers started asking who could keep them afloat when jobs disappeared. The club Joseph had fought over had to become, again, a place where envelopes meant diapers and coal. Even men who had opposed his campaign found themselves copying pieces of his quiet program: small loans, school shoes, visits to homes where illness had robbed a family of wages. In that sense, the work he had done had already outlived him. Police and prosecutors kept up their sweeps. They brought in the men who had stood beside Joseph for years and asked the questions they always ask after a high-profile killing. Who, where, when, how much? Most of those men had been in and out of interrogation rooms so often that they could have written the questions on the paper before the officer spoke. Few cases stuck. The city's courtrooms were not built to turn suspicion into verdicts without witnesses who would testify in public. The headlines moved on to other names, other corners, other schemes. A detective who had warned Joseph more than once said to a colleague in a hallway that a machine had rebalanced itself. He wasn't celebrating. He was describing the way a large system returns to the center after a long push against its edges. North Side figures did their own arithmetic. They had partnered with Joseph when it made sense and stepped back when the street got too hot. After his death, they tightened their ranks and avoided unnecessary collisions. The winter that followed was lean. Jobs that had paid cash for years shrank. Lines formed at doors that had never seen such lines. The North Side moved cargo when it could, left it when it had to, and watched as the South Side consolidated an advantage that had never been about a single man and had never depended on a single address. The club's rooms where Joseph had sat remained open. Minutes were typed, benefit slips signed, committees met. The men in charge emphasized order and normalcy. A priest was invited to bless a charity drive. Pictures were taken at holiday dinners. Elders who had backed Joseph in the heat of the fight kept their voices lower and their recommendations precise. Take care of your members. Avoid grand gestures. Remember why the association exists. Some of his changes became habit without anyone attaching his name to them. Scholarship envelopes continued to find their way to families who had never thought they would see such a thing from a club that had once been known mostly for funerals and wakes. The loan fund kept revolving because stores still needed stock and trucks still needed tires. Those were modest legacies. They mattered. His surviving circle scattered in slow motion. A few left for Buffalo, Cleveland, or back to the New York towns that had first taught them the rhythms of business in a new country. They took their skills with them: how to watch a street through a reflection, how to balance a ledger without lying to themselves, how to move goods without knocking over the furniture. Others stayed and learned to live with smaller ambitions. They joined legitimate warehouses, took jobs as foremen, or opened groceries that stuck to fruit and bread. A handful shifted to other crews, keeping a low profile, and never mentioning the years when their schedules were tied to the man who had believed he could force a club back into the hands of its members. In those choices lay a truth about that city in that era. Men made of the same material often ended up on different paths because of a few weeks, 1 year, and a few hours on a certain afternoon. Reporters tried to sum him up in neat paragraphs. Some painted him as the challenger, who held out for tradition against a force that did not care about tradition. Others saw a hard man who made hard offers, who put prices on heads and tried to turn restaurants into arenas for plots that would have harmed people who only wanted to carry plates and collect tips. Both portraits were true in pieces. He had bribed and threatened. He had plotted against rivals and rewarded anyone who would help bring them down. He had also cared for families, put benefits back on a schedule, and insisted that the club's original purpose was worth fighting for. The file on him in City Hall held all of that. It read like a ledger drawn in 2 inks. The crimes attached to his name did not vanish because the man was gone. Investigators continued to connect him to the loop of events that had defined the final years of the decade. He was tied to the ambush that brought down Tony Lombardo near State Street. He was tied to the home attack that ended Pasqualino Lolordo's brief tenure. He had offered money for a quiet death at dinner tables, and more money for a public reckoning that would remove the South Side chief entirely. He had carried pistols without permits, organized safe flats and watch posts, and taken a cut from routes he guarded. He had played a key role in the running battles that made judges weary and neighbors whisper. Those acts were choices, not accidents. He never asked to be excused for them. He believed they were the cost of keeping an association independent in a city that punished independence. If you look at the calendar that framed his end, you see odd echoes. His fall came the week the country's markets buckled. Within 2 years, the rival he had fought for so long would face a different kind of reckoning at a federal courthouse, convicted not for the street fights that had made his name famous, but for a crime that left no blood at all, taxes unpaid. That irony did not bring Joseph back, and it did not repair what years of conflict had done to neighborhoods where children learned to tell by the sound of a car whether to stay on a stoop or step inside. It did, however, change the stage. As the 1,930 seconds advanced, the association he had fought over kept its relief work quieter and its titles duller. The words Unione Siciliana faded out of newspapers, replaced by names that sounded more like benefit societies than councils of old country power. Family stories preserved a gentler picture than the clippings did. Nieces and nephews remembered an uncle who carried groceries up flights so his mother didn't have to. who kept a pocket full of candy for children and a pocket full of notes for errands he never forgot. Workers from his warehouses remembered paydays that came on time, and a boss who would step onto the floor to lift instead of just to point. Those memories weren't arguments. They were scenes, passed down because families need scenes more than they need verdicts. At a grave in a Catholic ground west of the city, relatives left flowers on dates that mattered to them and said little. A simple stone did the talking. A name, a set of years, a place where long days had ended. Historians later placed him in a larger pattern. The wave of Sicilian immigration brought languages, foods, and the habit of building mutual aid structures that could soften the blows of a country that did not always welcome newcomers kindly. Prohibition dropped a market into those neighborhoods that turned certain merchants into operators, whether they planned to become operators or not. The association at the center of Joseph's life was designed to protect members from hunger, illness, and loneliness. Men in his era learned how easily such structures could be bent into tools by outsiders who wanted reach as well as profit. He tried to push back. He did it with promises and with rifles, with envelopes and with ambushes, with patience and with wagers too large for the table he sat at. His story sits exactly where immigrant grit and American appetite collided. There is a lesson in how often his days returned to the ordinary. For every whispered plot, there were hours spent on phone calls about a delivery, a school note, a lease. For every headline written about a bounty, there were quiet decisions to cover a hospital bill or to bind up a feud before it cut deep. He believed that power earned in rooms like that could change who sat at a head table and how money moved. He was right for a season. Then a stronger system erased his name from the corner office and replaced it with a new name written in the same hand that had chosen the last two. His argument did not disappear. It slipped into smaller rooms and kept asking to be heard. That Sicilian clubs should be run by Sicilians who showed their faces in daylight and who remembered why the clubs had been built. As years passed, the city laid new tracks over old ones. The buildings where he had climbed stairwells for meetings were leased to businesses that never guessed what their walls had seen. The children who had chalked near the corner where the air went wrong grew up and left, returning sometimes with their own children to point at a block that looked smaller than it had in memory. Young people heard versions of the story, softened by time into something between a warning and a fable. The names blurred. The contours remained. A man from a small town in Sicily arrived in America, built a trade in cheese and groceries, took on a power bigger than his block, and pushed until he could push no longer. If you could sit with him for 5 quiet minutes, he might say that he had done what he could with what he had. He might admit that he had misread how long his luck would last, or how far patience could carry him. He might point to the elders who had asked him to keep faith with them, and say he had tried to keep that faith even when it cost more than he had imagined at the start. He might also shrug at the idea of legacy, because he understood that cities are made of today more than they are made of memory. Then he would stand, put on his hat, and step into a hallway with 2 exits, the way he had trained himself to do. The city that shaped him kept moving. Streetcars were replaced by other machines. The club he had fought to lead continued to pay for funerals, to buy medicine, to ease rent, and to show up with casseroles when a family needed a kind face at the door. The men who followed him kept titles without inviting too much attention. The women who had watched from windows kept their homes safe and their children steady. Life settled. The noise didn't stop, but it changed keys. It is tempting to measure a story like his only by its last page. That would miss the real weight of it. His life adds up in ledgers and in envelopes, in contracts and in quiet acts, in friendships that held, and in alliances that held only as long as they paid. He made choices that broke laws and put people at risk, and he made choices that helped neighbors live through weeks when the country's banks and factories stopped answering the phone. The contradictions are not the point to be solved. They are the point to be seen. In his time and place, a man could be both a benefactor and a menace, a neighbor and a rival, a careful bookkeeper and a dangerous strategist. Joseph Aiello carried all of that to the end. When night falls over that city, the lake throws back the lights and the wind reminds you that nothing stands still for long. Somewhere, a club treasurer locks a drawer after balancing columns, a priest takes a call, and a grocer props open a door to let in air. The old fights are gone, but the habits they taught survive in quieter forms. Stay close to your people, mind your accounts, keep your promises, choose your exits. That is the shape he left behind, not in statues or parades, but in small disciplines that make communities hold. If you listen, you can still hear the measured footsteps of a man who learned to walk fast without looking hurried, who believed that even in a rough era, the right kind of stubbornness could turn a room in the direction of its first purpose. Then the sound fades, folded into the larger breath of a city that outlives every name and keeps the stories anyway. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story from the Silent Empires. Joseph Aiello here, thanking you for joining me on this journey through ambition, rivalry, and the pursuit of respect. If this story helped you unwind tonight, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and join our family for more stories of gangsters and forgotten empires. Over 90% of our viewers watch but haven't subscribed yet, so if you enjoyed this story, your support truly helps us keep bringing these powerful tales to life. Share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories reach. Until next time, may the silence of the empire rest over you, and may the echoes of history carry you gently into sleep. Good night.